For number 17, just like number 15, we're faced with the situation here where we need to factor the denominators. So when we factor the first denominator, we see we have a common factor of n, so we factor that out, and we're left with 5n minus 1. And then same with the second denominator, we factor out an n, and we're left with 5n minus 1. And the right side, this 5n minus 1, that's its own factor. It can't factor anymore. So we have to take into consideration we have two prime factors in the first two denominators, and those prime factors are n times 5n minus 1. So we have to have at least those factors in the LCD. And then in the third denominator, we have just 5n minus 1. Well, that's already taken care of in this lowest common denominator. So we've identified our lowest common denominator. And now our restrictions, though, let's make sure we take care of those at this point. So at the very end, we can compare our answer to any restrictions that we might have. N is not allowed to be equal to 0 because it makes that factor equal to 0. And then what makes this factor equal to 0? Well, if 5n minus 1 is equal to 0. Let's do that right up in here. If 5n minus 1 equals 0, we add 1 to both sides, we get 5n equals 1. When we divide both sides by 5, we get n equals 1 over 5. So if n is equal to 1/5, it would make that denominator equal to 0, so n is not allowed to be equal to 1/5. So anyway, go ahead and multiply both sides by the lowest common denominator, n times 5n minus 1, and we can see here that we've got this denominator cancels, and so we're left with a 1 times 4n plus 12, plus this denominator cancels, and we're left with 1 times 1 equals, now this denominator here, 5n minus 1, will cancel with 5n minus 1, leaving an n times a 2, or 2n. If we subtract 2n from both sides, we get 2n on the left. 12 plus 1 is 13, so we're going to subtract 13 from both sides. We get negative 13 on the right. 2n equals negative 13, so n must be equal to negative 13 over 2. All right. Problem number 18. Let's see here. Problem number 18, we have to factor the first denominator. So we factor out an a from both terms, and we get a minus a times a minus 2. Same thing with the second denominator. We have a factoring out an a from these two terms. We get a times the quantity a minus 2. And then this denominator here, a, it's, well, by itself, it can't factor anymore, so we leave it alone. And we list each prime factor in our LCD. So a times a minus 2, that takes care of these two factors. A times a minus 2, well, those two go into the same one. And then this a goes into a times a minus 2. So that denominator is taken care of. And so we have our LCD. The restrictions are the a values that make each factor equal to 0, or each denominator. So a is not allowed to equal 0, because that makes a equal, well, it makes this factor equal to 0. And then 2 would make that factor equal to 0. So a is not allowed to equal 2. But we've identified our lowest common denominator, so we're going to take that denominator, we're going to multiply it by, I'm going to just I'm not even going to write it over here, there's no room. But this denominator here, LCD, we're going to multiply every single one of these fractions, both sides of the equation, by a times a minus 2. We can see here that this denominator cancels with the LCD, so all we're left with is 1 times a plus 5 equals, this denominator cancels with that, so we're left with 1 times 1 minus a cancels with this a, but we're still left with a minus 2 times 1. So we're left with minus 1 times a minus 2. And so what we have to do is make sure we distribute the negative 1 to both terms. Negative 1 times a is negative a. Negative 1 times negative 2 is positive 2. And be careful here, because you see an a there and an a there, you think that might be 0. But we're going to add a to both sides. It's not going to add up to be 0. We're going to subtract 5 from both sides. A plus a is 2a. And on the right side, we get 1 plus 2, that's 3. 3 minus 5 is negative 2. And so when we divide both sides by 2, we find that a is equal to -1. It's not a restriction, so we're done. Why it's doing that?